On the morning of April 12, 1981, a 14-year-old girl walked into Cabin 28 of the Keddie Resort in Northern California. She had spent the night sleeping at a neighbor's house. When she opened her own front door, she found her mother, her older brother, and his teenage friend beaten and stabbed to death on the living room floor. The condition of the crime scene defied easy logic. The victims had been securely bound with white medical tape and electrical cords. The family's 12-year-old daughter, Tina, was completely missing from the cabin. Yet just a few feet away in a rear bedroom, 3 younger boys had slept through the entire massacre entirely unharmed. Those bizarre details birthed 4 decades of true crime folklore. Media coverage and documentaries consistently framed Keddie as a flawless, locked-room mystery, a horrific anomaly executed in total silence by phantom killers who vanished into the mountains. But the reality of Cabin 28 is much less mystical. The murders remain unsolved because the local police department actively ignored viable suspects, buried hard evidence, and ruined their own investigation. Within days of the discovery, investigators had 2 highly viable suspects living right next door, a local man named Martin Smart and his houseguest, John Bo Bubiday. Bubiday was not a local mountain resident. He was an ex-convict with a lengthy record and deep ties to the Chicago organized crime syndicate. Both men offered alibis filled with inconsistencies. Detectives brought them in for questioning and administered polygraph tests that were later criticized as flawed. Instead of holding them, law enforcement told both men they were free to leave Plumas County. The perpetrators didn't pull off a vanishing act into the remote wilderness. The police gave them explicit permission to pack their bags and drive away. Weeks after the murders, Martin Smart visited a Veterans Affairs counselor. According to the counselor, Smart confessed to the killings. When this information was passed to the California Department of Justice, agents dismissed the report as hearsay and refused to pursue it. Smart also wrote a letter to his wife, Marilyn, shortly after leaving the resort. In it, he used language that reads as a direct admission of guilt to the murders. Investigators received this letter, but it was overlooked. It sat outside the official evidence record for decades, completely omitted from the case files. Law enforcement had a prime suspect alleged he confessed to a government counselor and put a near confession in writing. They chose to ignore both. 3 years after the murders, an anonymous caller phoned authorities with highly specific directions to the skeletal remains of the missing 12-year-old, Tina Sharp. Police found the remains exactly where the caller said they would be. But the cassette tape recording of that crucial anonymous tip was tossed into the bottom of an evidence box and completely forgotten. Then there is the issue of the murder weapons. During his initial interview, Martin Smart explicitly told police that his favorite hammer had suspiciously gone missing right before the murders. Police never bothered to look. The hammer sat untouched at the bottom of a shallow pond near the crime scene for 35 years. Inside the sheriff's office, the evidence room fared even worse. The original chronological case log vanished entirely. Crucial physical evidence collected from the cabin, including bloody materials, was heavily contaminated because a storage freezer was inexplicably unplugged. The physical evidence required to solve this crime was systematically mismanaged, lost, and completely destroyed by the people legally obligated to preserve it. The local sheriff at the time made a series of highly irregular staffing decisions, keeping his most competent, experienced homicide deputies completely isolated from the Keddie investigation. When the Department of Justice was called in to assist, they did not dispatch homicide detectives. Instead, they sent agents specifically from their organized crime unit to examine the quadruple homicide. Reviewing these decisions years later, special investigators concluded that the DOJ deployment was a calculated maneuver. They were likely sent to shield John Bubaid, treating him as a protected organized crime asset rather than a murder suspect. The investigation collapsed under the weight of intentional institutional shielding. Small-town incompetence provided the cover, but higher-level interference ensured the case went nowhere. Because of that shielding, both Martin Smart and John Bubaid lived the rest of their lives as free men. They died without ever facing a single charge for what happened in Cabin 28. It wasn't until 2013 that a new sheriff and a special investigator reopened the files. They dredged the pond to recover the hammer and combed through the ruined evidence boxes to salvage what they could. This chart shows a DNA sequence alignment extracted from a piece of medical tape left at the 1981 crime scene. By analyzing that surviving evidence, modern investigators finally secured a direct match to a known living suspect. The Keddie Cabin Murders survive in pop culture as an unsolvable enigma. But the facts prove that cases don't go cold because criminals are masterminds. They go cold when the institutions sworn to find the truth choose to look the other way.